The grocery store went silent. Her words cut through the air like a knife. Go back to Africa. Every shopper stopped. The sound of carts rolling halted. Even the hum of the refrigerator unit seemed to fade into the background. Phones came out, faces turned, and the man she was targeting suddenly became the center of a storm he did not ask for. He did not shout back. He did not flinch. He stood there, steady, like a man who had weathered worse storms than this. In that moment, his silence was heavier than her insults, and it unsettled everyone watching. Who was he? Why did he not respond the way most people would? And what truth was he about to reveal that would leave every single person in that store stunned, questioning not just what they had witnessed but also the world they thought they knew? What happened next would forever change how a town viewed dignity, respect, and strength. And before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Who was Darius Dawson, the quiet man in the hoodie? To some in that grocery store, he looked like just another customer, moving steadily through the aisles with a cart that squeaked at every turn. To others, especially the woman whose words cut so cruelly, he looked out of place as though his very presence demanded suspicion. But why was this woman so determined to humiliate him in front of strangers, to strip him of dignity with a sentence designed to wound? What made her so certain that no one would challenge her, that her voice would dominate the silence of the store? And more importantly, how did Darius Dawson, without raising his voice or lowering himself to anger, turn this ugly moment of hatred into something so unexpected that it would be remembered long after the shopping carts were returned and the doors closed for the night? What did he say that left not only his attacker speechless, but an entire community reflecting on what it means to truly see another human being? These questions lingered in the air that morning, unspoken yet heavy, waiting for answers only one man could give. Long before that grocery store confrontation, Darius Dawson's story was already being written in the quiet corners of service and sacrifice. He was not a man shaped by chance, but by discipline forged in the early mornings of military life, where every movement had meaning, every silence carried weight, and every decision could draw a line between chaos and order. As a veteran, Darius had lived through moments most people only see on screens or read about in books. He had crouched in the dust of faraway deserts with the sun burning overhead, listening for sounds that weren't there, waiting with the kind of patience that only comes from knowing survival depends on calm. Those years left him with calloused hands, a back that ached more than it used to, and a gaze that could steady even the most restless room. But they also left him with something greater, a commitment to build rather than destroy, to feed rather than take. When he returned home, he did not chase status or applause. Instead, he poured his time and energy into Dawson Community Outreach, a non-profit food cooperative that quietly became the lifeline for hundreds of families. From single mothers scrambling to stretch paychecks, to veterans like him who carried unseen wounds, to school children who needed full stomachs before they could focus on learning, Darius made sure they were fed. The co-op wasn't flashy. Its vans were old, its buildings worn, but every item stocked on those shelves carried purpose. He was the man who drove through storms with generators in the back, the one who stayed up late checking leaks in the shelter roof, the one who quietly restocked pantries after thefts or disasters left them bare. People who knew him respected him not because he demanded it, but because he never stopped showing up. In contrast, the woman who would one day try to strip him of dignity had a reputation of her own, and it was far less noble. She was known in her suburban circle as the kind who always had something to complain about: the wrong temperature of her coffee, the neighbor's grass growing too tall, the wait at the post office. Whispers about her were common in the community. She's always been like this. Her power came not from building others up, but from cutting them down. She had perfected the art of turning her dissatisfaction into a weapon, wielding words like accusations, certain the world revolved around her sense of being wronged. Where Darius found meaning in service, she found it in control. And while Darius's silence was grounded in strength, hers was filled with judgment waiting for the chance to spill. The paths of these two very different people were bound to cross eventually, and when they did, it would not simply be an argument between strangers in a grocery store. It would be the collision of two worldviews, one shaped by discipline, humility, and a lifetime of service, and another defined by entitlement, arrogance, and the assumption that her voice was the loudest in any room. Darius had been tested in deserts where bullets cut through the air, and in nights when the weight of responsibility pressed heavier than the dark around him. He had faced battles that demanded his patience and courage, but what awaited him in that small-town grocery store would test something else entirely. It would not be his strength under fire, but his strength under insult. Not the endurance of his body, but the endurance of his dignity. And for all the customers standing by with phones in hand, this test would reveal far more about Darius Dawson than they ever expected. The day of the incident began like any other for Darius Dawson. He had finished an early delivery for the co-op, unloading boxes of produce for a family that had been struggling to make rent. By mid-morning, he found himself at the local grocery store, a place where neighbors crossed paths without thinking twice. But on this particular morning, small whispers began to ripple before anyone even realized what was unfolding. A woman's voice, sharp and hushed, carried just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "He looks suspicious." Heads turned, glances darted, and though Darius noticed the weight of those stares, he kept moving. He knew that look. It was the kind that tried to make a man explain his own existence. But Darius, with years of discipline etched into his very being, simply adjusted his hoodie and pushed his cart forward, his face unreadable. The whispers grew into murmurs, and the woman's tone sharpened, gaining an edge of confidence now that others were listening. Her cart clattered against the floor as she marched closer, her expression twisted with something that had less to do with Darius and more to do with the anger she carried into every space she entered. Then, without warning, her voice cut through the store like a blade. "Go back to Africa." The insult hung in the air, heavier than the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Shoppers froze mid-step, half-turned between canned goods and cereal aisles. Mothers held their children's hands a little tighter, while others clutched their phones, some already recording, some too shocked to move. The silence that followed was suffocating, as though the entire store was waiting to see what would happen next. Darius did not shout back. He did not even blink in anger. Instead, he stood with a stillness that only comes from years of mastering patience. His silence was not weakness. It was tension coiled so tightly that it made everyone else in that store lean forward, wondering what would come of it. The woman, expecting an outburst, pressed on, her words spilling faster, fueled by the uncomfortable quiet of those around her. But the louder she grew, the quieter Darius remained, his calm presence drawing more eyes by the second. People began shifting uneasily. Some whispered, "Why doesn't he say something?" Others muttered, "This has gone too far." And yet, the scene unfolded with a strange gravity. The crowd's discomfort was growing, but so was their curiosity. Who was this man who absorbed insult after insult without raising his voice? Every second of his silence built pressure, until the atmosphere felt almost unbearable. The insult replayed itself in the minds of those standing there, forcing them to confront its ugliness, its cruelty. Darius's refusal to meet hate with hate was not what anyone expected, and it made the woman's rage seem louder, more desperate, and more out of place. He let her words echo, let them reveal more about her than they ever could about him. And then, just as the tension reached its breaking point as phones captured every angle and shoppers held their breath, Darius lifted his head and finally spoke. But what no one in that store knew was that the man they thought was just another shopper owned the very building they were standing in. What followed the outburst felt less like a shopping trip and more like a courtroom without a judge. The grocery store transformed into a stage, and every single shopper became an unwilling witness. Phones hovered in shaky hands, screens capturing every second. Whispers rolled down the aisles, fragments of conversations layered over one another. Did she really just say that? Why isn't he answering? Should someone call the manager? And yet, the manager, Kyle, stood rooted behind the counter, his knuckles pale against the register. He looked at Darius, then at the woman, and made a choice many in that store would later question. He chose silence. His eyes dropped to the scanner in front of him as though the hum of groceries being bagged could drown out the chaos swelling just steps away. The woman, emboldened by his refusal to intervene, leaned in closer, her words sharper, more venomous. She began threatening to call ICE to have Darius removed, her voice shaking with the kind of misplaced authority that thrives when unchecked. She promised to call the police, to make sure the news heard about this. The crowd shifted uneasily. Some glanced at Kyle, others at each other. A few raised their phones higher, their recordings now deliberate evidence. Others wrestled with guilt should they step in, or was filming enough. In their hesitation, the moment grew heavier, pressing on Darius like a storm that refused to break. But Darius stood as though he were carved from stone. Not a flicker of fear, not a flash of anger crossed his face. His military discipline, earned through years of standing in heat and dust with chaos erupting all around, was his weapon now. Where others would have raised their voices, his silence said more than any words could. Every insult hurled his way fell flat against that calm exterior. His composure unnerved the woman, though she pressed harder hoping for a crack, a reaction. But the truth was, Darius had been under fire before real fire. He knew the power of conserving energy, of waiting for the precise moment to move. Why didn't he fight back? Why didn't he defend himself? The questions would echo later in countless living rooms as the footage spread. But the answer was simple. Years of training had taught him that silence under fire could be more devastating than any shout. By refusing to meet rage with rage, Darius was forcing the crowd and the woman herself to sit with the raw ugliness of her words. Each second stretched, each insult sounded hollower, and her threats began to reveal more about her than they ever could about him. And then, as the tension crested, with Kyle frozen, customers divided between film and action, and the woman still throwing threats into the air like sparks from a dying flame, Darius finally reached into his pocket. He pulled out a set of keys. The metal clinked softly, a sound almost too small for the storm around him. But those keys would unlock a truth that no one in that grocery store was prepared to face. The sound of those keys echoed louder than the woman's threats. With every eye locked on him, Darius walked toward a narrow door tucked behind the registers, the staff entrance few customers had ever noticed. He slid the key into the lock, turned it, and pushed the door open. The crowd leaned forward instinctively, their phones rising higher to catch every second. Inside, the walls weren't lined with stock or supplies, but with framed documents, licenses, and certificates. And there, gleaming under the fluorescent light, was one in bold print: Dawson Food Cooperative, LLC. Darius took it down slowly, held it against his chest, then turned to face the stunned crowd. "This isn't just a store," he said at last, his voice calm but carrying more weight than any shout could have. "It's one of 3 I run. Together we feed shelters, schools, and families every single week. This building, these groceries, this community, they're part of something much bigger than me. They're bigger than all of us." The silence that followed wasn't the uneasy hush of moments before. This was different, charged, heavy, shifting. A gasp rippled through the aisles as realization dawned on the customers. The man they had just watched stand silent under a storm of hate wasn't just a shopper. He was the owner of the very store in which they stood, the man who had poured his energy, his time, his life into making sure the people of this town never went hungry. In that single moment, the balance of power flipped. The woman, who had puffed herself up with insults and threats, found her authority stripped away in front of dozens of witnesses. Her attempt to humiliate him became her own undoing. She had tried to cast him as an outsider, but he revealed himself to be the very backbone of the place she called home. Whispers filled the room, no longer uncertain but charged with admiration. Some customers lowered their phones, ashamed they hadn't spoken up sooner. Others began nodding, murmuring words of respect. A slow clap began near the back, tentative at first, then stronger as others joined in until the store filled with applause. People were no longer filming a spectacle. They were witnessing a revelation. The woman shrank back, her threats now hollow, her face flushed with the heat of exposure. And in that crowd, people realized the truth. She hadn't unmasked Darius, she had unmasked herself. The store's automatic doors slid open, and the crowd spilled out into the cool evening air. The woman, red-faced and shaken, followed close behind. Her voice trembled now, no longer sharp with accusation but desperate, searching for a way to undo the damage. "I didn't know who you were," she muttered, her words half apology, half excuse. The crowd hushed, waiting for Darius Dawson's reply. He turned toward her, steady, his calm presence a sharp contrast to her unraveling. His eyes held no anger, just a truth she could not escape. "That's the problem," he said evenly. "You thought you had to know who I was before you treated me like a human being." The words struck deeper than any raised voice ever could. Some in the crowd lowered their eyes, recognizing how often they too had been guilty of silent judgment. Others, moved by his restraint, stepped forward to thank him. A mother from the local shelter approached with her young son, her voice thick with emotion as she explained how Darius's food co-op had kept them from going hungry last winter. A man in a worn jacket shared how, during a blackout, it was Darius who had rolled up with a generator, keeping the neighborhood lights on when the rest of the block had gone dark. Stories spilled out, one after another, painting a picture of a man whose quiet strength had long been woven into the fabric of the town. And as each testimony came, the woman who had tried to tear him down grew smaller, her words of hate drowned out by voices of gratitude. At last, Darius walked to his van, white, unmarked, practical, the same one he used every day to deliver food to shelters and schools. He climbed inside, started the engine, and eased out of the parking lot. No dramatic gestures, no need for applause. Just a man returning to his mission. The headlights cut through the fading light as he drove into the horizon, the hum of the engine blending with the soft murmurs of a crowd forever changed. She tried to make him small. The narrator's voice carried, warm yet resolute. But by standing in truth, Darius Dawson showed a strength no insult could ever break. His silence wasn't weakness. It was the kind of power that reshapes a community, one that reminds us all of the simple dignity every human being deserves. The van rolled steadily forward, the sun dipping low, casting long golden rays across the town he had chosen to serve. And for those who had witnessed it, the moment would never be forgotten. What would you have done if you were in that grocery store standing just a few feet from Darius Dawson as those words cut through the air? Would you have stood in silence like so many others or spoken up? The truth is, every one of us faces moments where our reaction defines more than just the moment. It defines who we are. So let us know in the comments below, because your voice matters too. And if Darius Dawson's story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest truths. Subscribe now so you never miss our next stories that remind us of the strength, the dignity, and the humanity that can change the world. One act at a time.